everyone. Welcome to my talk, Accessibility Matters, Creating a Better Web. So I like to give a little explainer of what will be...
Close. Okay.
Okay, I like to give a little explainer of what will be going on in the talk. So we're gonna have an intro. I'm gonna do like a brief intro to accessibility, and then we'll go through examples of how you might be able to improve accessibility, and then we'll have a conclusion, of course. What this won't have is a reliance on slides. I've tried to add a little more wording so everyone here might be able to read a little more than normal, but I don't like to use slides a lot, so, and then I won't have any animation, because that's like a big accessibility no-no, and I don't have any cat pics, because I'm a dog person, and Remus requires me to put him in all of my talks. You can find my resources and slides after the talk, I didn't have a chance to upload them yet, at dragon.tech/PyCaribbean. And I'm trying to find some Spanish language resources, but it's been a little tough because I can't tell how good they are. So if anyone has any suggestions to put on there, please let me know after the talk. I'll be taking questions like in the hallway after the talk, so if you have anything you want me to go deeper on or need to clarify or anything like that, feel free to ask me. And during the talk, if I say anything that's like really hard to understand because it's like an idiom or something like that, please let me know. A little about me. I'm a current technology evangelist and former web developer, and I am also a boot camp grad. So I went through like a full-time school to get into web development about 3 years ago now. And before that, I'd been working in like international development kind of, and I have an MA in international peace and conflict resolution, which is why I like to say I was very interested in web accessibility to start out with, because when you learn conflict resolution, it's a lot about like seeing what people really need as opposed to like what you think they might need. And web accessibility is also very much like that. Like you can have an idea of what you think people might need, but your users with accessibility needs might actually want something completely different from you. So we're gonna like explain what web accessibility is for anyone in the audience that doesn't know, just briefly. So the W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium, are the people who kind of make standards for things like HTML and also web accessibility. And they have what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. And we're currently on WCAG 2.0, and they're working on WCAG 3.0. And this basically means that they want people, regardless of their accessibility needs, to be able to use the web the same way other people are. So the example I like to give is it's not like you're trying to necessarily make the web a better experience for anyone else, but like my father, who doesn't understand what like a URL is, and a deaf person who doesn't understand what a URL is should have the same level of experience, that experience on the web. And like people like most of us in the room who are really good at using the web like should not have a different experience than anyone else. And for WCAG 2.0, they follow guidelines called CORE, and that's just that it's perceivable, meaning like you can see it and view it, or listen to it, or whatever. It's operable, meaning you can use it. It's understandable. So that kind of makes sense. And then robust, meaning it's not just like people like seeing a website as like a PDF or something, as opposed to like what the website actually is, if they can. So WCAG 2.0 is adopted officially in a few countries across the world, and technically the US just picked it up, but it's also, different countries have different ways of forcing people to use it. Sometimes it's a law, so you should be following it. Sometimes it's a suggestion. Oftentimes it's just for government websites or websites that are things that people should have access to, like grocery stores or universities and that sort of thing. And a lot of countries that signed on to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of I need to look this up, on the Rights of Person with Disabilities from 2006 are also trying to improve their accessibility. So like Mexico and similar countries have certain projects in place for their government websites to get them better. People with disabilities make up anywhere from like 10 to 20% of most populations. In the Caribbean, the statistics I found was like 10 to 12%, so that's like 10% of the population at the lowest is going to have a disability, which is like a huge amount of people when you think about it. And WCAG and other resources tend to separate these people into 5 categories. So it's visual, so like blindness, color blindness, but also things like glaucoma, which makes your vision blurry, things like floaters, which like put little lines in people's vision that move, and if you are like working on a game or something on your website and it requires people to see little details, like that could affect it. There's auditory, so deafness, and but also things like tinnitus, where people hear ringing in their ears, so if they have to listen closely to something, or if like the volume's like very low on what you have, that can be an issue. There's motor and physical, so that's like things like cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, that sort of thing, and people might not be able to use a mouse, or they might not be able to use a mouse well, and they might have issues around that. And cognitive and neurological. This could be like autism or dyslexia or various other issues, and we'll discuss like some of the specific ones as we go through the examples. Oh, and language speech. So this can be like mutism, stuttering. As we get more into using technology that requires voice, this becomes more of an issue for people. So if they're using something like Alexa or their phone and they're speaking into their phone, if they're stuttering, that can cause problems with programs. But these 5 categories are pretty deceptively simple because this is just for things that people acknowledge as disabilities, and lots of other issues can come into play when we're talking about web accessibility. So one way to break them down, which I first saw from a Canadian accessibility expert on YouTube called David Berman, is to put them into the following categories. So there's permanent, so that would be like being born blind. It's something you have and you'll probably always have. There's temporary, so that can be something like getting sick, or like seasonal allergies that make your eyes blurry, or things like that. There's acquired, so this is like aging, right? As you get older, it might get harder to use the web. And there's societal, and the best example of this is left-handedness. So some people might design apps or the mobile web page for their apps as assuming people have are using their right hand to navigate it, and that can cause issues for people who are left-handed. And people with accessibility needs might also be using tools that you're not planning for. Most people kind of design their websites and build them thinking that a mouse will be in play, but oftentimes there are other tools that, that might be used, and these are called alternative input or output tools. So people might be using eye tracking. So it's like a low camera on their computer that follows what their eyes do. They might be using their mouths because they'll be able to like control their breath or their tongue, and they'll have like something called sip and puff, which allows them to control a web page that way. A lot of people with vision issues use something called a screen reader, and they'll oftentimes use their keyboard to navigate the web page, and the screen reader will read off what they're going through on the web page. So there's lots of ways they're interacting beyond the mouse. So as I said, like categories can be deceptively simple, and one thing you have to think about is that normally people don't follow into just one of them. Like anyone can get sick, everyone's going to age, and oftentimes people with one disability will have another problem as well. So it's not just like, oh, I've got this one category covered and therefore have everything for this type of person covered. And a way to think about this that's found in a book by Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher called Design for Real Life, which is pretty thin and easy to read, so I suggest it. But they talk about looking at these things as not edge cases, but stress cases. So it's like if you think of them as edge cases, that normally means like, oh, we'll never have that problem. Like that doesn't happen. But if you think of them as stress cases, that means you're thinking of them as tests for your application. You're thinking of them like, well, if this works, then that means that we're automatically a little better and that we'll be able to handle other stress cases that come up. And so it's like just a way of thinking about it that makes it a little like easier to really take these seriously, I think. So we're gonna move on to some examples. I always like to give them because in case you haven't like seen them or heard about them. So color and size is a really big one for the web, especially when we're talking about text. So if something is darker on a lighter background, it's easier to see, right? And if it's bigger, it's easier to see. And I like to think of them as like vision tests. If you've ever taken one of those, like an eye doctor will make you read through the lines to see the smallest line that you can read. And this is kind of like people with vision problems can often be viewing the web like this. If it's bolder and bigger, they can actually see it. If it's smaller, it's harder to see. Also for dyslexia, if the fonts don't really make a difference between different letters, that can make it harder to read. So the first one's like what I'm using, and the one and the lowercase l and the capital I are all different. But then Calibri and Lato, which is like a really popular one right now, they are not so different. Like, you can't tell the difference between the L and an I, even if you don't have dyslexia. So thinking about like the different serif fonts can help, and like comparing different letters can help a lot. There's also alt text. So this is the thing you see if like an image breaks and like a description's there. And it's also something that screen readers will read out to people for images. So, if you always add that to your images, it will automatically make it easier for people to like understand what they're on. But if it's not an important image, if it's like just something people are meant to pass over, you can also sometimes leave that blank, which I think like not a lot of people think about. But if you're just putting images on your website that aren't really important, like that's something to think about too. You can also make changes noticeable. And so for this, I like to say like, if you're making a login form or something and the password's wrong, if you don't give any feedback and let people know, hey, your password's wrong, like it's hard for them to know. Is it like the website? Do I have to try to log in again? I don't know. So oftentimes like you might make something red to demonstrate that it's wrong. Or you might put like an X there to demonstrate that it's wrong. And then if you tell them it's wrong, like that's even more feedback that they get. And so like the more noticeable changes you can do, the better it is for everyone. So there's also ARIA, which is used by screen readers, and it's like a way to communicate with them, to give them more information. So for the example before with the password, you can do an ARIA alert that alerts someone on a screen reader who wouldn't be able to see any of those messages about the password being wrong, that their password's wrong. So they too can also interact with it. And you can use it to add more descriptions. You can use it for all sorts of things. Oh, hi. And there's like a lot of different ways to use it, but also if you don't really understand it, like you should avoid just putting it on everything, because people have a tendency to do that, and then you actually break accessibility you already have because you're overwriting it with ARIA. So in the W3C standards, they go over that too, and I could do an entire like presentation on just that. So, and if I'm giving the impression that like accessibility is just a few things and it's just like adding alt text, it's just like color contrast, obviously like we wouldn't be giving accessibility talks if that was the case. I like to talk about it as a story from like my childhood, and there were these books for kids that were like about this weird school, and all these like silly things happened at the school. And at one point they got elevators in the school, but they were going to simplify it and have one go up and one go down. So like no one was ever interrupting anyone when going into the elevators. But they hadn't considered that they actually have to get back into place. So the elevators only went up and only went down. And there was only one ride in any of the elevators. And that is very much what accessibility tends to be. At my last job at PBS, we did a lot of video, right? And we go through and we do lots of tests on our competitors, you know, to see what they're doing, to see how well we're doing against them. We'd put on like a blindfold and headphones, and we go through navigating their sites with our keyboards and a screen reader on. So it was just reading the information from their sites, and we were seeing what we could access. And the step process was we'd go to their homepage and we'd go to a video from the homepage, and we'd see if we could play it and we could pause it. So it could play and then we could stop it and see how easy that was. Most of our competitors had it so you could get to the video and play it, but you couldn't pause it. Because someone thought, oh, well, we need it to be accessible for people to play video, but no one thought we needed to be accessible for people to interact with that video. So the only way you could pause it was like refreshing the page or navigating away. So it was really hard to use. And this is kind of like an elevator, right? Like it's kind of like you're just thinking of the most basic initial steps, and you're not thinking about what happens after that. But like, this is all like pretty easy to avoid. I think like anyone can help make accessibility a little better, regardless of their role on a project. So for example, in design, or if you have any design feedback, you can push to avoid gimmicks. Something like infinite scroll, where like you scroll down the page and like more images or whatever loads, and then you scroll a little more and more loads and you get bumped up. Really hard for accessibility, hard for anyone if you're trying to use a footer too. Like you can never access that footer, and if you're on like a screen reader, you might never be able to get to like a right-hand sidebar either, right? And you can think about how your users use your products, because it's not so much about like the average user or the general user, it's also like, what are they doing on your app? What is your site for? what would be the user flow that your users would do? And then optimize it for that, knowing that like your site is probably different than other sites in at least some small ways. You can avoid what's called user hostile decisions. So like you might have heard of user friendly, and this is the opposite of that. This means that it's something where you're like actively annoying or possibly even harming your users. So for example, you might have heard that flashing images can give people seizures. So that would be a user hostile. That sets off a seizure in a person. So like any sort of animation can do that. Sudden sounds for people with like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or anxiety, that can be really hard on them because they're not expecting it. It's suddenly there, and it like makes them a little anxious. It makes like anyone a little anxious, I think, when you have sudden autoplay on something, right? So just think like at a base level, like what do people not like? And then think about like how that could be like actually really bad for someone who might have like a further issue with it. You can also push back on inaccessible decisions. I find the way this works really well is if like someone wants to do something that you know is inaccessible and you can find a way, like an alternative or a way to make it better, and you tell them that. A lot of times like they didn't think about that and they don't want to do the work thinking about that. And if you do the work for them, like they'll just agree to it, right? Because it's like an easy solution. And you can also do opposition research, like what we did at PBS. You can go to your competitors and see what they're doing. If they're more accessible than you, then that means that like somewhere between 10 to 20% of like the population might be better served by your competitors, and that's not a good thing. If they're less accessible than you, that means that like you could have that niche, right? You could be the one getting those people to you and getting people from your competitor's website. And the thing about like people with accessibility needs is we tend to talk to each other and like make recommendations to each other. So like that just goes through the community, and suddenly you're getting users you might not have been expecting because your site is better for them. You can try to keep like the bare minimum, even if like it's changed a little. So for example, on Google, if you go to like just google.com or whatever, you might see like that it has an outline around certain things when you click it. And that's for keyboard navigation. It's like the focus state is what it's called, and it's the keyboard equivalent to a hover state. So it's like where the equivalent of your mouse pointer is if you're using a keyboard, and it lets you know where it is. A lot of people try to get rid of this. They think it's ugly or disruptive, so they'll have you take it out of the code. And that's really bad, because then that's like you just have an invisible mouse pointer. You know, like you can't find it, you can't interact with the page as well. And so if you need to like change the color of it, or make it thinner or thicker or something like that, like you can do that. Just make sure it's something that's observable, that people can see if they're using their keyboard. And that's a way to like keep the bare minimum, to keep like just as much accessibility as someone might let you put in. Link decorations are also an example. So the classic, like you hover over a link and there's an outline. That's a link decoration. And it doesn't have to, or there's an underline. It doesn't have to be an underline. It could be the text gets a little bigger or bolder. It could be like all different things. And obviously like the more choices you are using, the better, because if you change the color, someone that's colorblind might not notice, right? But this is like another good way to give feedback to whoever's using your website and make it easier for them to use it. And it's also like a bare minimum sort of thing. It's like the least you could do and not hard to implement. It's just like a few lines of CSS for most of this. You can also remember that words are important. I don't think this gets talked about a lot with accessibility, but your users are reading what is on your website. They're reading that copy, and you want to remember that like your users have probably certain words that have been used against them that they don't want to see, right? There's a keyboard company that I was looking at that does like those ergonomic keyboards. It's like the keyboards that are good for your wrist. And I was reading through the website, and at one point it said something like no sane application would use these controls to like talk about some sort of hotkey thing it was doing. And the thing is, like, when you say something like that, everyone knows what you're implying, right? Like, it's a word that's used for human beings, and you're saying, like, no good application, or no logical application. So people who, who have mental illness will see that and be like, oh, so you think maybe I'm not good, maybe I'm not logical. And it's not like a huge deal for most people, but it's like a little thing that adds up as they go through more and more websites and see that all the time. So even if you're not like doing design or the coding, if you're making the copy, you can also consider like don't use words that are used for medical conditions unless you're a medical website, right? Like that's a pretty easy one to handle, I think. You can also just do little tests. You can try keyboard navigating your website. You can get a screen reader and run through that. There's a lot of different screen readers out there. Some of them are free. Mac comes with one. Windows comes with one. There's like a Chrome one you can install and just have on Chrome. And then you can like use Tab and a few other keys to go through your website and see what happens. Like see if it's hard or if you have some ridiculous things being said or what. And for keyboard navigating, like there's a few settings you can turn on to make it easier, but a lot of that's just done with Tab. You can also get real input from users. So if you're working for someone that does UX research at all, like this is something that falls into that. So you just have someone with a disability go through the website the way you would with like any UX procedure, and that's user experience. And if there's any sort of like budget for that sort of thing, they're probably paying like random people to just do it. So you could get a little more specific on what type of people are using it and plan for like those edge cases, the stress cases like we mentioned earlier. And if none of that's possible, there's also like getting feedback and making it easy to get feedback from people. So if your site has like a link that lets people contact you about issues they're having on it, that can help prioritize what is happening on your site. If people at your work are like, oh, no one cares about that, but then you actually make it easier for people to report what they're having issues with, you might find that actually there are things people care about, and now you have like some sort of proof that you can take to people and be like, here's something we need to do. Here's something that someone cares enough about that they're actually contacting us about. There are also lots of benefits beyond just like a happier user base. So a good accessibility equals good code, right? The people in charge of HTML standards, the W3C, are also the people behind the web accessibility standard. So they've kind of mixed them together. So the way your HTML is set up should automatically be a little more accessible. So that means like, if you have a tag called aside, that's for a sidebar, you'd be using that for a sidebar. Or like headings, which a lot of people use just to make text bigger in different sizes, those are supposed to be in a certain order. And you're only supposed to have one H1 heading. That's like the top heading on a page. So this just makes your code a little bit better. Which also makes it less work for future developers, and I like to say, and/or future robot overlords. Because if the HTML is good, that means that they don't have to go searching for different things while they're working in your code. So if they come in later and they need to put a heading in, or they need to find like navigation or something like that, it will all be clearly labeled for them. It's also good for web scrapers, and that means it's good for search optimization. So when you think about it, the web crawlers that are going through for things like Google search aren't interacting with your web page the way that a user is. It's looking through certain information. You have like headings and that sort of thing to make your listing on a search page. This is also true about different voice and like AI assistant things like Alexa and Siri. They're also interacting more with like the words in your page and the way the HTML is formatted than they are the visual aspects that you might be thinking of. So having an accessible web page can be really good for that too. It's also the law in certain countries, depending on what your website's doing. So if you're like, if your country is one with those laws, or if you're working remotely for someone from a country that like operates in a country with those laws, you could end up having issues legally. And for a lot of those countries, if you do what's called like a good faith effort, which means like you're showing that you're working towards fixing that, it helps a lot if there's like a lawsuit or something of that sort. So there's lots of reasons for accessibility, and it will make your users happy, it will make other developers happy, it will just make your site better in general, and it will make it easier to work on your site as well. Finishing up, as I said, I have resources at dragun.tech, that's dragun.tech/PyCaribbean. And I have a link there for JAWS. That's the most commonly used screen reader right now. It's for Windows, but you can also go to Microsoft and download a virtual machine for Windows and just play it in there. And that's actually good even if you have Windows, because the free trial only lets you use 30 minutes at a time. So you can just shut that down and restart it and restart JAWS instead of having to restart your computer. And there's lots of browser extensions to use. I've included a few of those too for testing things like especially color contrast and other like easy to hit issues. And if you need to for any reason, you can contact me. I'm at LM, as in Michelle, dragun@gmail.com. And also, there should be some contact information on my site. And I just want to thank you all for coming and showing some interest in web accessibility. I know it can be kind of overwhelming, but you are like improving your product and making it better for your users and people all over the place. So thank you.